Oh, hello there, friends. How are you all doing on this fine evening? Wet and windy where I am down here in Cornwall. Hope it's as thoroughly miserable for you as well, so that we can enjoy a whiskey all the better, knowing that we are tucked up inside with a tasty dram, or two, as the case indeed is. Once again, we are doubling up on our live tastings this month, tasting both our world whiskey and single malt scotch, that being Westland and Bladnoch. And we have two wonderful guests to join us on this journey this evening, Rosie Higginson and Chris Riesbeck. So what we're going to do is, here's the sort of program of events. We're going to bring Rosie in first to talk a little bit about Bladnoch, talk a little bit about Vinaya, the dram that we have all got this month. And then we will taste with Chris. We'll bring Chris in from Westland because we'll get his opinion on the dram as well, get an American's palate opinion on the dram. And I know that he likes Bladnoch already because we just talked about it. And then we will go on to talk a little bit about Westland, which will start at around about 8:20. And we'll get Rosie's opinion on that. So it should be a lot of fun. As usual, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to field them. And we will do our very best to answer them. But without further ado, I'm going to bring in Rosie Higginson. Hello, good evening, Rosie.
Hi, evening.
How are you doing tonight?
Good, yeah. Bit windy, same as with you.
Yeah.
I think we've got a storm brewing, so apologies if there's any disruptions, but all good this evening. Thanks for having me.
All right, absolute pleasure. So, Matt, what do you do for Bladnoch? What's your job, and how did you get your job there? Everyone always wants to know how you get into the whiskey industry. So tell us about your journey briefly, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, of course. So I'm actually the visitor centre manager, and I've been doing that since June 2019. But my background is in whiskey, and I actually had my first job at Bladnoch Distillery when I was a student. So I grew up in the area, and I was a summer tour guide.
Ah,
so
nice.
That was with some previous owners back in sort of 2011. And then as I went through university, I moved on to like distilleries more in the Central Belt, and just stayed in the industry. I did a whole host of things, tried a lot of different stuff, sales, kind of cask purchasing, buyer, things like that. But Bladnoch was on my radar as a kind of potential career back home where I'm from. So yeah, it was really nice when I heard that it had been taken over, that they were up in production, reopening. So yeah, in 2019, they offered me the visitor centre manager role, and it's been a roller coaster with the old pandemic and everything, but here we are.
But outside of pandemic times, you've got quite a busy visitor centre there, I believe, right?
Well, yeah, we don't really know of an outside of the pandemic time. So we opened at the end of July 2019. So by early 2020, it was already affecting things. It's been a bit on and off since then. But yeah, we certainly hope so. I remember 10 years ago, we were getting like 5,000 visitors through the door. So we would hope we'd be doing at least that in a normal year when that comes eventually, if not a fair bit more. So
yeah.
Okay.
All right, cool. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the sort of high and low points of Bladnoch's history over the years. Give us a potted history of the distillery.
Yeah, so when I was writing the script for the distillery tour, this is definitely the bit that takes the longest. So I'll try and condense it slightly, but we're a pretty old distillery. We're built in 1817, built by two brothers who were the McClelland family. They were local farmers, so they lived nearby and they farmed the land. So yeah, over 200 years old now, and it stayed in their family for roughly 100 years, and then during the First World War, like a lot of distilleries, it closed. And it's had a pretty checkered past since then. Multiple owners, constantly opening and closing. It was owned by United Distillers Group before, in sort of the 80s, and before that it was Bell's group. Most of Bladnoch was going into Bell's blended whiskey. So you won't see a whole lot of really old stock of Bladnoch single malt. Probably also worth mentioning, it's the most southerly distillery in Scotland. So we're quite far down, almost the most southern point of Scotland, right on the coast. So it takes quite a while to find us. And I think that's maybe contributed to the fact that a lot of companies kind of taking it on and then letting it go. In the early 90s, it was bought by an Irish family, the Armstrongs, and they were actually going to convert it, because it was mothballed, they were going to convert it into holiday houses. Thankfully, they didn't. All the equipment was still there. It wasn't in the best condition, but it was all there. So they petitioned to get it back up and running, and it took until the year 2000. So from 2000 to 2009, they were doing quite a small production run, I think roughly 100,000 litres a year.
And that was legally limited, wasn't it, via the deal in which through the purchase,
for a while,
right?
Yeah. United Distillers or Diageo, I guess, but capped it at 100,000 litres. So you can do that in a pretty short space of time. It didn't require many staff, and then just because it needed a lot of work, it needed a refurbishment, really new stills, etc. They stopped producing in 2009 and kept it going until about 2014, mostly warehousing and visitor attraction and things like that. And then in 2015, it was bought by David Pryor. So that's our current owner, who has done so much for the distillery and for the community. I think
and he's Australian, right?
Australian, yeah. So
and am I right in thinking he's the only Australian to own a single malt distillery, I believe, right? In Scotland, that is, of course. There are obviously single malt distilleries in Scotland that are owned, in Australia, that are owned by Australians.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I think he planned to build a distillery. He had some land up in the Highlands, and he was going to build his own one. And about that time, Bladnoch came up, probably thinking that it would be easier, but he needed a completely new distillery, basically. So yes, he put in brand new equipment with the help of his master distiller, and that started back up in 2017. Pretty exciting. We go from 100,000 litres to about 1.5 million litres now, so we're really ramping things up.
That is quite a ramp up, isn't it? So you mentioned it's the most southerly distillery in Scotland, and that puts it firmly within the lowland region. And in the past, there's been a lot said about the regions of Scotland and sort of the particular styles that are expected to come from those regions. And anyone who sort of subscribes to that idea would think that lowland distillery means light, grassy, that kind of thing. What does lowland mean to Bladnoch? And do you think that, because there's not many distilleries to sort of prove of any particular style, right? So what does it mean to Bladnoch? And do you feel like Bladnoch conforms to that kind of idea of light?
Yeah. I don't know if I would describe Bladnoch as light. It's certainly grassy, and it's quite citrusy, which I guess you can compare that to something like Auchentoshan, which is also a lowland. But yeah, it's definitely sort of easy drinker, breakfast whiskey, I've heard, for the lowland. I've heard ladies whiskey, which I'm not sure what I think about that. But yeah, it definitely does. It has sort of fresher, maybe more green apples, freshly cut grass, all these kind of notes. But it's certainly still quite creamy and malty. And we also do a limited peated run every year, so we do try and change things up a bit as well. So
yeah, nice. So what about Vinaya, particularly within the portfolio that you produce? Where does that sit, and what is it doing that other whiskies that you make are not doing?
Yeah, so Vinaya is quite new. It was introduced last year. Because we've had quite a few gaps in production, our stocks tend to move as time goes on. So whereas we had a 10, a 15 and a 17. We've now got a Vinaya 11-year-old, 19-year-old, and 15-year-old. Oh, sorry, 14-year-old. So, yeah, Vinaya is new, no age statement. Something that we actually do quite a lot is a no age statement, because we try not to restrict ourselves to any specific age. We try and really focus on distillery character. In terms of where it fits in the rest of the range, in terms of price, it's the lowest price single malt that we do. I don't know, doesn't really mean much. It's a mix of bourbon, first fill sherry cask. So that's the only one of its kind at the moment. And yes, I would say, speaking of those sort of light, fresh, fruity characters, it certainly shows off our Bladnoch character really well. And actually a lot of the flavour profiles that we get from our new make spirit are coming through quite nicely in the wine as well. Nice.
Well, when we tasted this before we put it in a pouch, we have designed the labels with obviously the little tasting icons on the front, and we put pear, grass, and chocolate truffles. And I think, I'm seeing tasting notes come up on the chat already, which I'm going to put up in a minute. But some of the stuff that you've been saying, I think, kind of conforms to that orchard fruit, grassy. But then there's something else there as well that gives it a bit of length and body. And for me, that's chocolate truffle. And I don't know whether that's, a bit of the sherry cask and then, probably the ex-bourbon cask too, in concert with one another over a period of time, just giving some of that more dessert-like quality. But I think we should taste it. I'm tasting it.
I've got a bottle. I don't have a pouch.
Well, you've got a bottle, and I know someone else that's got a bottle. And that is Chris Riesbeck from Westland, because I sent him a bottle. Because shipping pouches over to Seattle or the US is not the easiest. So I'm going to bring Chris in now, because he's going to taste with us. He's got a whole bottle. He's going to start getting through it, right? Chris, welcome.
A whole bottle. I just want to point out that Rosie literally had me captivated the moment that she said breakfast whiskey.
I know, right? There's something quite alluring about the prospect of breakfast whiskey, unless you had too much dinner whiskey the night before, and then it doesn't seem so attractive, right?
I will tell you, Bladnoch has a special place in my heart. I was telling Rosie and you, Tristan, before we jumped into this, that I used to work for Gordon & MacPhail here in the US before I came to work at Westland at the distillery. And Bladnoch was always one of those, it was like a happy day when we got the new cask offering list and there was Bladnoch in there, because it's something that hasn't always historically had a huge amount of awareness in the US, but the whiskey is so good. It's Rosie was nailing it. That orchard fruits, fresh cut grass, like overripe melon, you just can't miss. Even frankly, on the popping the bottle, you really pick up a little bit of that milk chocolate note. And man, is that just such a treat.
Yeah, for sure. Right. Let's, that's a fantastic introduction of what isn't even your whiskey, Chris. So I can't wait to hear you talk about Westland. So what we got here? Pears and grass. We have got, I'm sure we've had some more. There we go. Sherry and chocolate comes through lovely. Makes it less sweet than I thought it would be. Bit of sherry. Yeah. Definitely fresh and floral. Yeah.
Has great viscosity, real mouthfeel to it. There's so much natural oil. I love the fact that this is at 46 and change. This is, for anyone that's listening that is a budding distiller or someone that is friends with someone that owns a distillery, 46% and up is your friend. Run in that direction. There's a completely different quality of mouthfeel in a whiskey with this sort of alcohol behind it. It's so balanced.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, I think once you get above that ABV, you're allowed a certain amount of tactile grip on the palate from the alcohol. It sort of adheres the flavor to your mouth that little bit better. And the good thing about high ABV, and we've talked about this a lot on Whiskey Me Tastings before, is you can always add water to it, right? You can't take water back out of a 40% whiskey that should have been bottled a little bit higher.
Yeah, maybe worth mentioning it's all non-chill filtered. That's why we keep it above the 46% mark. And it really adds that kind of creamy element to it as well. I get really intense vanilla tonight off Vinaya. But yeah, almost like boiled soup. That's something we say quite a lot.
I always think it's funny how so many of our tasting notes, I think that we all naturally gravitate towards is stuff from your childhood, right? It sounds like we're trying to sell whiskey to kids when we start talking about different types of candies and chocolates and sweets, but it's sort of where you learn flavor, isn't it, when you're a kid, and they kind of hold true. And forevermore, we're comparing stuff to sweets and candies that we ate when we were 5 years old.
Yeah, well, pear drops is another one for sure.
Yeah. I don't think it's also just because a lot of the aromas that we detect in like fermented products are actually found in like sweets and candy, right? They're just sort of in their purest form, chucked in there for like pear drop flavor or Army and Navies or whatever, licorice, that kind of thing. You know, it's sort of concentrated form. So they really feel apparent when we smell them in whiskey. But the magic of it is, of course, that it's all just made from cereal and yeast and water.
Yeah.
I think there's an argument to be made, and I'm not sure it's one that's commonly made, that there is more interesting whiskey being produced in the lowlands right now than a lot of parts of Scotland. I think when you look at the stylistic variance that exists within the lowlands, as a region with admittedly not a ton of distilleries, there is really different spirit coming out of each of those facilities. And this is awesome. This is the lowland single malt that I think when you're taught, right in the beginning of your career, like, oh, here are the 6 regions, here's what the 6 regions should taste like. This is stylistically correct for what I think people expect a lowland to be. And whether or not that's what a lowland should be, that's a totally different argument. But what I love about this is that it's a classic example of what a historical style would have been. You can taste this and go, this is to a certain degree exactly what you want a lowland to be. There's fruit without it being overly ripe, but there's also enough herbaceousness that you get a whiskey with real nuance. I mean, even when you swallow this, there's a ton of underlying flavor that just kind of lingers on the palate, which I don't know. I mean, to me, I'll pay extra for a whiskey that sits around on the palate after you swallow it. Like I feel like there's so much whiskey in the marketplace right now where you take a sip of it and it's poof and gone. And this isn't that at all. And I'd like to think, God, I hope that Westland will have the same sort of experience for folks, because this is really, it's almost like you're getting to experience 3 whiskeys, one on the nose, one on the palate, and one on the finish.
Like that. Yeah. And indeed, we should be paying extra money for it. I mean, if it lasts longer, it's better value, right? Something in that, I'm sure. Right. I can't wait to hear what you got to say about Westland, Chris. This is going to be amazing. Okay, let's move on to Westland. So, Chris, you're not actually in Seattle, it turns out. You're like about 6 hours away or something crazy, because the United States is so damn big. You're on the East Coast at the moment.
We are a large place.
Yeah.
I'm on the East Coast. I'm spending some quality time with my wife, which is a bit of a treat.
Lovely. So what does she live in you're on holiday there together? She doesn't live on the East Coast and you live on West, right? That would be
No,
crazy.
She lives on the East Coast and I just go back and forth because I'm a sadist
so you commute.
and I love flying. Yes.
Yeah. That's a long commute.
You get used to it. It is funny. You get to the point where you see the same flight attendants, the same pilots on the same routes, and they're just like, oh, when are you staying and when are you going? And you develop your own little favorite places that you get to go to, and you get a lot of takeout. You get to know a lot of local restaurants.
Yeah. So what's your what is your sort of general arrangement? Do you go over for a week and then back for a week? Or how does it work?
It's I guess maybe the better question is during COVID or before COVID?
Yeah, true. That upsets everything, right?
So
yeah.
At this point now, I'm probably going over once a quarter for a week or two at a time. And then typically, non-COVID, I'd go over once a month for a week and a half. And, we've got a business that's not only just here in the US. We sell whiskey across the entirety of the United States, but we're now selling whiskey in about 15 countries globally. So actually being on the Eastern US, as much as it feels like it's a million miles away from the distillery, the reality is with our business growing so much globally, from a time zone perspective and having calls with European markets, it actually makes things a little bit easier. I remember originally I was like, oh man, maybe it'd be better to be out on the West Coast. And then it was one of those very quickly I realized that the only 2 markets that would really make easier would be calling Australia and calling Japan. Whereas a bulk of the Western European markets, if you wake up on the East Coast, you have about a half a day that you can work together.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, like that Pacific Coast is not near much apart from like the Pacific Coast.
It's a good way of putting it. Yeah, we're a little isolated in that regard. I mean, we talk about that all the time at the distillery. It's like the type of person that settled out on the West Coast in America was like that mindset and that spirit that said, I'm not okay just sort of like landing in the US and then saying, this is good enough. It was this desire to explore, to kind of see the world in a different way. And I'd like to think that a spirit of that lives on in the whiskey that we make at Westland. You know, single malt from America is obviously a relatively new thing, and we've been leading the charge on this for nearly 10 years now. So to see that we're getting to the point of a recognized standard of identity, a way of saying to a consumer, you know, the way the SWA does for consumers of Scotch whiskey, the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission that we co-founded was this idea of trying to say, this is what single malt whiskey from an American producer should be, and setting it up in a way that wasn't so restrictive that it kept people from making what they wanted to, but also ensuring that consumers had a basic standard of identity and an assumption of quality for what it is.
That's the trick, hey, because we have the Scotch Whisky Association in Scotland over here, and they have to walk that fine line between sort of protecting the status and the style of the product, whilst also still allowing for some degree of innovation and creativity within that. And you have to be so careful with it, because if you clamp down too much on distilleries, then they are at risk of losing market share to other producers who can do cooler, more innovative, and be more dynamic and you know, react quicker to market demands. And it's a challenge. So how did you go about doing it
Yeah, we thought of it a little bit differently. So think of bad regulations are designed like a box, and you say, okay, here's the box. If you fit in the box, you get to call yourself X, Y, or Z. Really good regulations, good governing bodies should act like a funnel, and they say, okay, as long as you do X, Y, and Z, you can proceed forward. And with the American Single Malt Commission, what we've tried to arrange here is a way that says, listen, we don't want to be Scotch in America. And it's not because we don't love single malt Scotch whiskey. I think single malt Scotch whiskey is amazing. I think single malt from around the world is excellent. But what we don't need to be doing is emulating what other people produce. I would rather be the first great American single malt distillery than the 137th best single malt Scotch whiskey distillery. It just doesn't make any sense to me. You know, I love the fact that in Scotland, you can produce a style of whiskey that's entirely to you. But I think it's fair to assume that there are some concerning aspects of the SWA that restrict producers from having as much innovation as possible to them. At the end of the day, I'm a firm believer that a consumer with disposable income decides what they like. What I don't want are governmental agencies to say, well, you can't make it that way. And I think the SWA does a really good job at very clearly defining, hey, this is what single malt Scotch whiskey needs to be. Where I always get hesitant is when it goes, well, you can't do this, and then you can't do this. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Let's look at just the term at a very broad scale basis, right? Single distillery, 100% malted barley, fermented cereal mash, you know, distilled to no higher than X, bottled no lower than Y. As long as you cover those things and then their age statement requirement, I feel like anything outside of that should be fairly open game. I mean, we take full advantage of that at Westland, you know, whereas almost the entirety of the single malt whiskey community, not only, you know, in Scotland, but really around the world, there's this real focus on using pale malt and using either ex bourbon or ex sherry. You know, we're using a 5 malt mash using quite a bit of roasted malt, the way that a brewer would use to make, you know, stouts and porters. That same type of malt goes into making, you know, our distillate. Now, historically, distillers would look at that and say, well, that's really inefficient because you're going to pick up all of your flavor from the barrel. But the reality is that, well, what if you want to celebrate the raw materials? You know, fundamentally, right, 4 things go to make whiskey. You need water, you need yeast, you need barley, and you need oak, and a tremendous amount of copper, you know, that's fashioned into a still. But at a basic level, we treat barley like it's fuel. Like its only purpose is to make alcohol. And the reality is that barley actually has an enormous amount of flavor. You went into any brewery on the planet and they were like, well, barley's not important, it just makes alcohol. You would never drink their beer. You would run away from that place as fast as humanly possible. And for us at Westland, we recognize that we're in the Pacific Northwest, arguably one of the best parts of the world to grow malting grade barley. And it's like, well, yeah, we want to celebrate the fact that we've got this incredible raw material source right here local to us. We've got this wonderful craft brewing scene that understands that not all beer needs to be a lager or an ale, and that there's a ton of different flavors that can be coming from that. So yeah, we've tried to emulate that.
That's my kind of take. I visited the distillery about 3 years ago, and my sort of take home was this perfect fusion of the kind of West Coast American craft brewing scene which had obviously been gathering pace for some time, and this dedication to making the best possible American single malt whiskey. You kind of combine the two together, and that for me was Westland. Can you talk a little, because some of the stuff you guys are doing is really pioneering, and it's not necessarily all relevant to the whiskey we're trying today, because I know some of it's work in progress. But talk a little bit about the peat that you're using from Washington, and also the Washington oak casks as well, right? I mean, this is a serious dedication to creating a Northwest American whiskey where everything is sourced within I don't know, a couple 100 miles of the distillery. Like talking about wood, cereals, peat, everything.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'll start with sort of maybe just describing quickly what the American oak is. So the American oak that everyone got in their pouch, that's our 5 malt barley bill, matured in 2 different types of air dried new white American oak. So some 18-month air dried with a heavy char light toast, and some 24-month air dried with a heavy toast and a light char. Now, all of that's been matured a little over 4 years. So just like Bladnoch, we're a non-age statement, but for what it's worth, if you're curious, on the back of the bottles, when you buy a full 700 ml, you'll see that it says the sort of general age of what all the whiskey was in the bottle. But what you're talking about is our Outpost range, which is a new series of whiskeys that we produce. So we've got 3 whiskeys in that. We have a whiskey that comes out every spring called Calere, which is Latin to cultivate, and that's focused on entirely new varietals of barley that are growing in the Pacific Northwest in a sort of very small agricultural valley called the Skagit Valley in Washington State. Now, what's interesting is, the varietals of barley that are used broadly in our industry are fairly restricted, in the sense that you're going to use things that are, fairly high yielding, disease resistant, but they might not necessarily be the focus on, are these really interesting flavors? And admittedly, if barley doesn't pass the objectivity test that most large scale brewers want, which is, does it germinate in so many days? What is the yield that we get out of a ton of it? It won't get brought into the commodity system. So for us, it's trying to break away from that commodity system by using these new varietals of grain. To the best of my knowledge, we're the only distillery in the world that is fully funding a PhD student at our local university, Washington State University, to do public interest work on the flavor of barley. So for what it's worth, everything that we're learning from this project doesn't just get locked behind the Westland door. This is stuff that's openly sourced and available, to the point where our local maltsters, Skagit Valley Malting and Link Malt and Mainstem, that are doing some of these really interesting varietals for us, this is things that are benefiting the brewing industry. They're benefiting the food industry. We're learning so much. And just last year was the first time we released Calera Edition 1, which was using a 6-row winter varietal called Alba. And this year, it's going to be a 2-row winter varietal called Talisman, that, to our knowledge, has never been used in the distilling industry before. And they're, these are whiskeys where it's all focused on second and third fill casks. So there's very low oak element to them. And you're getting this really interesting flavor that comes through sort of broadly from it, and much more in the sort of tropical grilled fruits thing going on, which is just so much fun. But then we also have 2 other whiskeys in that range. So Garyana, which comes out every fall, typically in the September-October window, and that's using our local species of oak, Gary oak. So it is not only a protected species of oak by the United States Forestry Service, but it's actually a fairly huge fine if you cut down any of those trees in the Pacific Northwest. So we have to work with local timber farms and local farms that have what they call hazard oak, that they can cut down with legal approval, and then be able to make these wonderful casks. If you've never had Garyana, the best way to describe it is, whereas American oak is very much sort of custard, coconut, vanilla, Gary oak is basically all of those things drenched in American barbecue sauce. It's ginger and clove and nutmeg. It's spicy. It's the difference between clear rum and pot still Jamaican rum in terms of funkiness. There's really big flavors there.
Do you do you treat that oak, as in toasting and charring, the same way you would treat your other casks that you're using? And by the way, your other cask for the American oak, is that a combination of virgin and ex-bourbon you're using? Is that correct?
It's predominantly virgin. There is occasionally, in certain vatings, we'll add bourbon cask to it, but it's not in every single vatting. Again, we vat to profile instead of to recipe, like any distillery would. So if the vatting doesn't require some ex-bourbon cask, then we won't. But more often than not, there'll be a few bourbon barrels in there. And in case people are interested, our vatting sizes tend to be between 25 and 40 casks at a time now.
Okay. And so the Gariana oak, are you putting the same char and toast profile on that wood as you are your virgin cask? Is it the same cooperage and everything, just different wood?
No, it's a different cooperage because, again, we're working with Independent Stave Company for our American oak, which is more in the sort of Kentucky, Missouri area where you classically see Quercus alba grown. We buy a majority of our Gary oak right now from Sig and Moreau, which is out in California. They also have a cooperage out in France, but they get access to some of that Gary oak. But a lot of it's coming from really kind of smaller local producers because the accessibility of it is really limited.
Yeah, nice. And then I think the third one you were going to mention was the peat. Peat, yeah.
So it'll come out for the very first time ever in January of 2023, which is going to be a whiskey called Solum. Latin
I'll
for
take
soil
a bottle, please.
earth. Save
one for me.
Yeah, it's going to sell out quickly. We made a very small amount for the first run, but to your point, Tristan, this is entirely produced with our local peat source. So I don't know if people appreciate that. Actually, there's a huge amount of peat accessible in the United States, but a lot of it is in wetlands, which is protected by the Environmental Protection Agency. So accessibility to it is really, really limited. So what we've done here is we found a local family that has accessibility to a peat bog on their property that we're sourcing from. And what's really neat about this is that the profile of peat from Washington State, as all peat should be, it's driven by the vegetation that's present in the bog. So we have something called Labrador tea out here, which is a very distant relative of rosemary. It's got this wonderful eucalyptus and menthol quality to it. So what we're going to have to get people to understand with Solum when it does come out is that peat, aside from being a yes or no question, is a yes, no, and where. I laugh, but I tell people all the time, like, peat, when you ask if a whiskey's peated, it should really like open a flow chart. And then it's like, okay, is the whiskey peated? Yes. Well, where is the peat from? How is the peat treated? How much peat was used to dry the barley? And all of those things have a huge impact on the overall whiskey. But we are, as you can probably imagine, we are really excited about the launch of that whiskey.
So a final question on these whiskies that we're not actually tasting. So you've got the peated malt and you've distilled that, you've stuck it in a leaded cask, and you're going to release that as Solum. Now, I believe you also have some of that whiskey maturing in the Gariana oak cask as well, right? So then you would have the full Washington, like full house kind of thing, correct?
Tristan, I have no idea what you're talking about. It's hard to envision a world with that level of inception. It's like a whiskey inside of a whiskey inside of a whiskey.
Exactly. Yeah.
To sort of spoil the lead, but yes, we are in the process right now of peating local Skagit Valley varietals matured in Gary oak. We're admittedly, we are years away from when that whiskey would release as a sort of tête de cuvée, but the early samplings of that stuff, because we've got some stuff laying down, is really kind of fascinating. What you don't want to do in that, and it's a really tough thing for our blender Shane to do, is you want to make sure that you're celebrating all three of those various elements, right? You want to celebrate the malt, you want to celebrate the Gary oak, and you want to celebrate the peat. Well, more often than not, you get two, but not three. You're happy if you get one, you're thrilled if you get two, but getting three is really, really difficult.
Yeah, otherwise it sort of begs the question, what's the point, right? And there has to be a point. You can't just release it because, oh, hey, look, we managed to do all these clever things. Sorry, it doesn't taste quite right, or, it only tasted the peat. It's such a balancing act, and of course, never been done before either. So you're really kind of writing the rule book as you go along.
There is an element of this where we sort of run and then learn how to walk.
Love it. Right, cool. Let's go back to American oak and let's taste it. I've already been tasting it here because it's freaking delicious, and I couldn't hold back. But Rosie, have you had some?
Yeah, I've had quite a lot of it.
Yeah. What do you think of it?
It's amazing. Yeah, really, really enjoying it. The first thing that came into my mind, and it kind of almost reminded me of something at Bladnoch, actually, when you go into the tun room, sometimes I get like this really intense, like banana bread type of smell. And that's kind of what I got, really sweet, like almost tropical. And definitely like a coffee, chocolatey, almost like stouty type of flavor as well.
For sure.
So Rosie's hitting on our fermentation. So we don't use the M strain of yeast. So for those of you unfamiliar, pretty commonly used now in the distilling industry is effectively a super attenuating yeast. So the M strain, which is designed to basically eat all sugar that is present. And it does it really quickly with little thermal sensitivity. At Westland, we use a Belgian Saison brewer's yeast. So we get this, we ferment at a relatively high temperature. So forgive me, I can never do the conversion quickly, but I want to say it would be your equivalent of about 25 C. So what is that? Like, I think 80-ish degrees Fahrenheit. Yeah. And what it ends up doing is that yeast, when it stresses hot, it creates a lot of esters. So esters are what gives you that banana, cherries, orange peel thing going on. And we need that because roasted malts on their own, if we didn't use that strain of yeast, you'd get this really sort of bitter, acrid note out of it. Like, I always laugh. If Westland were done with just standard distilling yeast, we'd get like the aroma and the flavor of like a very bitter coffee. But when you use the type of yeast that we use, you end up getting like the crema on a top of a cup of really good coffee. That sort of like slightly sweet, fruity, but also savory note to it.
Love it when a whiskey speaks to its place as well. And of course, Seattle's pretty famous for coffee, right?
we certainly have it. We have a touch of it out this way. That's for sure.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, the tasting notes we put on the pack, banana, coffee, and then malt. And that's sort of, I think for me, it's interesting what you say about how so much that comes from the fermentation, because it's sometimes it can be misleading. You're like, okay, cool, I'm tasting coffee. So presumably that's from the roasted malt, or could it be from the cask? And there's so many different places where these flavors can come from. But that banana-y note, and it's in a way, a lot of it reminds me of like just like a really good Belgian beer or something like that, you know, where it's sort of got tropical fruit notes, but also like that kind of coffee and malty, cereally darkness to it as well. I think it's amazing. Really, really great whiskey.
Yeah, we're really proud of this. And listen, I'm a sales guy. I can't even help myself. So I tell people all the time, what we do in this whiskey, a non-traditional yeast, air-dried new white American oak, roasted malt profile, that is almost every other distillery's limited edition whiskey. And that's our entry whiskey. That is the very first thing that we make on a daily basis. So, for a whiskey that's, I want to say in the UK, I think we've just sort of absorbed some of the tariff impacts. So now we're down to about 50 pounds a bottle, give or take. The reality is that, it's a huge bottle of whiskey for that price.
It really is. Yeah. So much so that we've bought nearly all of it in the UK, I think.
I think you guys literally cleared us out.
We have basically run the UK out of supply to the point where, unfortunately, some of the pouches that we send out each month go missing in the post. It's just inevitable. And we can't even resupply those that have gone missing this month because we've just bought everything we possibly can, hundreds of bottles. So hopefully it becomes available again because it's bloody tasty. Cool. Let's get up any questions, guys, if you've got anything for Chris. And Alexander Driver. Is the heavy toast giving the coffee tobacco notes?
It's from the roasted malt specifically.
That's from the roasted malt. Yeah. What else have we got here? Someone said, can we comment on Bladnoch? I can't find it now. But of course you can. What have you got to say about Bladnoch that you haven't already said? It's great, the two different whiskies, right? I mean, we go from this sort of like stalwart of lowland kind of character with that grassiness and that those orchard fruits that we mentioned. And then we're on to something like Westland, which is sort of more bold and sort of, more intense. And, when I taste it now, I'm getting a little, there is just that touch of bourbon or rye coming through, I guess, from the virgin cask. It's just that sort of little nod to, classic American whiskey production. Here we go. Bladnoch lingers a lot on the tongue.
With the Bladnoch, Rosie, do you guys have a specificity for the type of sherry cask that you want for those?
In terms of the Vinaya, I think it's mostly American white oak sherry casks. And we have a range of different sizes as well in the warehouse. So if you ever come to the distillery, we have some like 120 litre sherry casks, which is quite cool because they obviously react quicker as well. So yeah, we use a mix of European and American oak even in the sherry. But in terms of Vinaya, it's first fill bourbon and first fill, I believe, American oak sherry as well. So you can definitely get that coming through.
And do you know if that's Oloroso or Amontillado mixture? Probably.
I think I'm pretty sure it'd be Oloroso, but it doesn't actually specify.
Yeah, well, there you go. That's a positive comment on our dual tastings that we're now doing. Well, look, guys, someone said no poetry. When we did this last month, it was Burns night tasting, and I recited some Robert Burns poetry in what I thought was a Scottish accent, but it turned out it was actually Irish upon delivery. Much to the amusement of about 150 people who were watching at the time. I'm not going to do any poetry this time. Don't worry, guys. It's all good. Someone said would love to try Westland New Make. Now, I did try Westland New Make when I was out there. I can't remember exactly what it tasted like, but what I would say, and Chris, I'm sure will agree, is a fantastic distillery to visit if you're over in Seattle. It's absolutely beautiful. It's got a wonderful bar there, and the tour is one of the most thorough distillery tours I've ever been on, and I have been on a lot of distillery tours. You can pick your level of geekery, and you go down as far down that rabbit hole as you would like to go. I mean, they've got a lab there and all sorts of interesting stuff going on. Every single person that works there is basically a whiskey geek, from what I can tell.
Yeah, it sort of self-selects for employment at Westland, that's for sure.
And a final comment on Bladnoch. Have you got any flavor pairings that you like to do, Rosie, with Vinaya or any of the range? Someone's saying here that I can't pronounce that name. Imptiful is saying Bladnoch's excellent with salted caramel, dark chocolate. Is there anything you do at the visitor centre in particular with flavor pairings?
We certainly have done. It's not something we do like regular as in an experience, but yeah, we will quite often host dinners and pair things with each whiskey. Certainly with Vinaya, just things like we've been saying, anything that is quite refreshing tends to be. I did, I think it was the Persia Whiskey Festival, and we paired it with their starter, which contains like pears and apples and sorbets and things like that. But it also certainly has a sweetness that could go with like a vanilla-based custard, like a creme brulee or something like that. So yeah, definitely we can do loads of food pairings. It's something we really enjoy. We've got one of our tour guides is actually a semi-retired chef, so he's always making wonderful things. He made a marmalade last week using the whiskey, and he'll bake a cake and put a bit of our sherry matured, Pedro Jimenez sherry matured in it and things like that. So yeah, we're always playing around with things.
Fun, isn't it? I'm going to go one more question here. This is a Westland one, which I can partially. Oh no, not that one. Sorry, this one. How many women work at Westland? I know that I met at least 2 or 3 when I was there. But
yeah, we're really fortunate. We've got a pretty mixed team. So let's see. Our director of finance is a woman named Carrie McCall, who's immensely talented. Our director of hospitality is a woman named Phoebe Hopkins, who's unbelievable and hopefully coming back from maternity leave really soon. We miss her terribly. Our events coordinator, Hannah Bowles. Our front of the house supervising manager, Hannah Nelson. Our IT manager, Ellie Wong. And let's see, I'm missing someone here and shame on me. Our cocktail program manager is a woman by the name of Jenna Sagmon, who is also incredibly talented. I'll tell you, the bar at Westland is really high for quality employees. We've got some really great team members.
Yeah, I confirm that. Right. Thanks so much for your time, guys. And thank you everyone for joining. That was super interesting. And I just love the way these conversations go when there's 3 of us. It used to be so boring when it was just me and someone else. And now that we get to interact a little bit more and comment on each other's whiskies, it's really fantastic. And you both had such great things to say about each other's whiskies as well as your own. So appreciate that too. And thanks everyone for tuning in. And we will see you next time. Bye-bye.